Thank you for joining us for part one of our special education pro bono training. My name is Jen Massey. I'm the pro bono director at Children's Law Center. I'm going to talk with you just briefly to provide an introduction for today's training. I'll talk just a little bit about our pro bono program at Children's Law Center, a little about our virtual training series and the logistics, some preview of today's training, and then where you can find on-demand resources. Children's Law Center fights so each child in DC can grow up with a loving family, good health, and a quality education. We serve over 5,000 children and families each year, and we do that with the assistance of hundreds of pro bono lawyers. We place pro bono cases in family, health, and education. We're here today to talk about the special education work that we do. We support our pro bono attorneys from screening our cases, thinking through the issues that are involved in the case and what would require a successful outcome, whether or not that's more appropriate for our in-house attorneys to handle or would be appropriate for a pro bono lawyer who doesn't have experience and expertise in this area. We provide trainings and different materials to support your work, and we provide mentors. So we have staff who have been doing this work, lots of experience practicing in DC, who are available to guide you in the duration of the case, from the beginning to the end. Our virtual training series is cutting across all practice areas, family, health, and education. You'll also see circled here a special training on cultural humility that also applies to all of the areas of practice that we do, with the goal of providing culturally humble representation and achieving our clients' goals and advocating in their best interest. Today's training, part one for special education, is focusing on what is special education? What is the law that applies here? What does the process look like in a special education case? What are the steps that you go through? There's a lot of material. There is additional supporting material and resources that we're not covering today, but have been a part of part one for special education. So what is a disability? Some information about the medical legal partnership at Children's Law Center, where we're getting these referrals in these cases. We also have some information just about the logistics of DC schools, as well as more information about 504 plans, as compared to what you'll hear more about today, IEPs or Individualized education programs. We are doing these cases remotely, so I have a note here about that. In terms of how the school year ended, we had attorneys on these cases doing remote meetings with the school. We are advocating with our clients and communicating with them remotely, and that's an area where we can guide you through the mentoring process if you take a case with us. You'll see finally on this slide questions. We invite your questions. We welcome your questions. You can put them in the chat today. We may cover them during the training or at the end, or after the training if necessary. If you have questions because you're watching this on demand, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, Jen Massey at Children's Law Center, to send along your questions so we can answer them. Our on-demand resources on our website, everything from presentations and videos to manuals. When you go to our pro bono page, you first go to childrenslawcenter.org. There's a pro bono button at the bottom of the screen, and when you click there, you're going to see this page pull up, and on the right side, different links to the materials I just referenced. If you are interested in a case, any type of pro bono case, or have questions, you can certainly send me an email. Finally, we will have a training survey for all of the trainings, that we're doing virtually. We'd love to hear your feedback for the content and also how the virtual training experience is going, where we are being effective, where we can improve. So you'll see that in the chat feature if you're joining us live, and you'll see it available on our website if you're watching this on demand. Without further ado, I'm excited to share two of my colleagues are presenting today on part one. I'm going to first hand it over to Cheryl, who is a staff attorney at Children's Law Center, and she'll then be handing it over to Janine, who is a supervising attorney at Children's Law Center. I will stop sharing my screen, Cheryl, so that you can go ahead and share yours. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Good morning again. My name is Cheryl Cozart, and I'm here to talk with you today about what is special education. So let's start with the legal authority for special education. First, at the federal level, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. You'll hear several people in schools talking about it as IDEA. It's found at Title 20 of the U.S. Code, Section 1400. Also, the federal regulations are 34 CFR, Parts 300 and 301. for ages 3 to 21 years of age. And for ages 0 to 2, you'll find it at Part 303. There are also local regulations, the District of Columbia Municipal Regulations, Title V. In addition, we have OSSI. Let me tell you what that is. That's the Office of the State School of Education. Oh, I said it wrong. I'm sorry. OSSI is the Special Education State Education Agency for DC. They have Office of Due Process Hearing Standard Operating Procedures Manual. That's a mouthful. The policies and guidance documents promulgated by OSSI and DCPS. DCPS is the DC Public Schools. And also you can look there for COVID-19 guidance. Let's talk about the special education system framework. So when I think about a special education system framework, I think about it in terms of a pyramid. And at the top of that pyramid would be the state education agency. That's the state school system of the state in which the child resides that oversees all LEAs in the state. So an LEA is what I would consider to be at the bottom of the pyramid, the local education agencies. And you can see 20 USC at section 1412 to see more about that. And in DC, the Office of the State Superintendent for Education, also known as OSSI, would be the state education agency. And you'll hear a lot about OSSI if you take a special education case. Again, the local education agency known as LEA, you'll hear that acronym a lot. The local school system of the county, city, or town in which the child resides and oversees the day-to-day delivery of specialized instruction and related services to children with disabilities. In DC, we have more than one LEA. We have the District of Columbia Public Schools, that's its own LEA, or the Independent Charter School, or LEA Charter. So all LEAs have the same legal responsibility regardless of size. So what is the IDEA? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a federal statute that is meant to ensure that all children with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE. And again, if you take a special education case, you'll hear those acronyms often, FAPE and LRE. Children ages 0 to 22 years old are covered by the IDEA. For children ages 0 to 2 is Part C of the IDEA, and for children ages 3 to 21 is Part B of the IDEA. So what is special education? It's specially designed instruction provided at no cost to the parent that meets the unique needs of a child with a disability. Special education can include travel training, vocational training, specialized academic instruction, related services, classroom accommodations and modifications, and you can see more about this at CFR section 300.39. Related services can also include speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, counseling services / behavioral support services, transportation services, parent counseling and training, and medical services. And you can see more about this at 34 CFR at section 300.34. In addition, there are accommodations or modifications and supplementary aids and services that a child may need, such as a dedicated aid, the use of an iPad, special seating, adaptive furniture, extra time for tests, breaks during testing or class, and testing at the best time of the day for the student. In addition, specified form for directions such as repeated written or oral directions, use of a calculator, use of lined paper or graph paper, or basically any aids, services, and or supports that a child needs to be educated in their least restrictive environment. Now there's a key term that we want to talk about that I mentioned earlier. Again, it's FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Special education and related services are provided at no charge to the parent under public supervision and direction. Those special education and related services must meet the standards of the state education agency. And again, in DC, that's OSSI. They're designed to meet the individual needs of the child to ensure the child makes educational process, and are provided in conformity with the child's individualized education program, or their IEP. And you'll hear more about that later. In addition, there's an important Supreme Court case from 2017, Andrew F. B. Douglas County School District, where the Supreme Court said that a child's educational progress cannot be trivial or de minimis. It must be appropriately ambitious in light of the child's unique circumstances. Another key term is child find. DC must ensure that all children with disabilities or suspected of having a disability residing in the city or who are wards of the city and who are in need of special education and related services are identified, located, and evaluated. And this applies regardless of the severity of the child's disability. It includes children who are not attending school, who are homeless, who are wards of the district, or who are attending private schools and public charter schools. Another key term, IEP, Individualized Education Program. It's a written statement for each child with a disability that is developed, reviewed, and revised in accordance with the IDEA. It's the plan governing what a child in special education should be receiving as part of his or her education. And Congress has envisioned the IEP as the centerpiece of the IDEA's education delivery system for disabled children. Honig v. Doe is another important Supreme Court case that talks about the IEP. Now, another key term, as we mentioned before, is LRE, the least restrictive environment. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who do not have disabilities in a general education classroom. Children with disabilities should attend their neighborhood school unless that school does not have the kind of program that can meet their special needs. And there are several steps to obtain special education. First, there's referral. Second, evaluation. Third, eligibility determination. Fourth, IEP development. Fifth, placement determination. Sixth, IEP review. And seventh, re-evaluation. And we'll talk about each one of those steps in a moment. Let's start with referral. Step one, in order to be evaluated for special education and related services, a child with a suspected disability must first be referred for evaluations. A child must be referred by either their parent, an employee of the school system, an adult child, or an employee of another state agency. And so how are referrals made? Referrals should be made in writing to the school system or principal. Referrals for children ages 0 to 3 should be made to OSSI for early intervention. They have a strong start program for ages 0 to 3. And for children ages 3 to 5, the referral should be made to early stages, another early intervention program. So let's think about this for a minute. Why are referrals made for evaluation? So let's think about some examples of instances where a parent might make a referral. For instance, if a parent is reading with their child at home and they notice that their child does not know his or her letters, for instance, by age 4, or cannot retain that information, they may be concerned and may want to make a referral. Well, what about a doctor making a referral? A doctor may see a client in their office and may notice that the child can't grasp certain tools, and they may want to refer the child, maybe for occupational therapy, for instance. Why would a school employee make a referral? A kindergarten teacher, for instance, may notice that a child is not retaining information, may be mixing up his or her letters or words, and they also may want to refer the child for evaluation. What happens once a referral is made? The school must hold an MDT IEP meeting after the referral is made and before conducting evaluations. MDT means multidisciplinary team. And again, IEP is Individualized Education Program. So they must hold a meeting after the referral is made and before conducting evaluations. What happens once a referral is made? At the meeting, the school should review current information and data about the child and any pre-referral interventions. If further evaluations are needed, develop a student evaluation plan, or an SEP, detailing the reasons for the referral and the evaluations to be conducted. Explain to the parent what evaluations are to be conducted and obtain informed consent from the parent of the child. So let's talk about the multidisciplinary team and IEP team. The team must include the parents, a special education teacher, an individual who can interpret evaluation results, other persons at the discretion of the parent or the LEA who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child, if appropriate, a representative of the LEA who is knowledgeable about general curriculum of the LEA, knowledgeable about the availability of resources of the LEA, and qualified to provide or supervise the provision of special education. Step 2 of the 7 steps. Step 2 is evaluation. The LEA is responsible for conducting a comprehensive and individualized evaluation to determine whether a child is a child with a disability and the educational needs of the child. DC Code requires the school to complete initial evaluations within 60 days. There are common types of evaluations. One is psychological, and there are 3 main areas of testing for a psychological evaluation: cognitive/intelligence, social, emotional, and academic testing. Let's talk about the difference between a school psychologist and a clinical psychologist. School psychologists only need to have a master's degree and be licensed by OSSI. Clinical psychologists have doctorates and have state licensure to practice. School evaluations will give classifications from IDEA. Only clinical psychologists can give DSM-5 diagnoses. Common types of evaluations such as psychiatric and neuropsychological. A psychiatric evaluation would be conducted by a psychiatrist. IDEA permits this type of evaluation, but schools rarely do it and refer out. It's not a good alternative to a psychoeducational evaluation and should be conducted in conjunction with it. There's also a neuropsychological evaluation, and it's typically conducted when a child has experienced a brain injury. There are common types of evaluations. The common types of evaluations have related services connected to them. For instance, a speech and language evaluation you would use for physical ability to produce speech or expressive and receptive language. Occupational therapy evaluation for fine motor skills or sensory differences. Physical therapy evaluation for gross motor skills. Assistive technology evaluation looks at whether any technology can assist the student's educational functioning. And a functional behavioral assessment would be a series of observations to determine the root causes and triggers of a student's problematic behaviors, and is used to create a behavior intervention plan. So imagine if a child has been diagnosed with ADHD and does not have special education services at their school. Your client's main concerns are the child has trouble paying attention, he struggles with reading, he's very impulsive and fights with classmates and teachers when frustrated, and writing is difficult to read. So then you want to think about, well, what evaluations do you ask for? Again, if you were to take one of our special education classes, you could refer back to the types of evaluations that are possible. And you may think, oh, if the child is very impulsive and fights with classmates and teachers when frustrated, you might want a functional behavioral assessment as an example, or maybe a speech and language evaluation if the child is struggling to read. Step 3 of our 7 steps is eligibility determination. Once all evaluations are completed, the school must convene another MDT/IEP meeting. This meeting is to review the evaluations, and it's a meeting that must include someone who can interpret the evaluation data. The MDT/IEP team must determine if the child is a child with a disability as defined in the IDA, and if that disability impacts the child in the school setting such that they require specialized instruction and related services. When making this determination, the MDT/IEP team must review the evaluations and other relevant information such as existing evaluations provided by the parent, information provided by the parent, assessments conducted in the classroom, state and local assessments of the child, observations of teachers and related service providers. And so there are several disabilities under the IDEA. Autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech and or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, including blindness, and developmental delay. Now, what if a parent disagrees with an evaluation? After a request, so if the parent disagrees, the parent may then request an IEE, that's an independent educational evaluator, so an outside evaluator. The LEE has two choices under the law if the parent makes that request. The LEE can provide funding authorization for an IEE without unnecessary delay, or that LEE can file a due process complaint against the parent to prove the appropriateness of their evaluation. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Janine Tillery for the remaining steps.
Hi, good morning. Again, my name is Janine Tillery. I'm a supervising attorney, and I'm going to continue. I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm going to continue with the next step. So at this point, assuming that eligibility, and there's an eligibility meeting that determines that there is a need for an IEP, step 4 is the development of the IEP. The IEP is developed by the NDT and IEP team, and the IEP has to include several things or several components. It should include the child's present levels of performance, information on how the child's disability affects his or her involvement and progress in general. The IEP should include measurable annual goals and objectives, levels and types of special education related services, aids and services, and program modifications. This still continues in even though we're in this time of pandemic. There's no waivers on, IEPs and what they should include. So this information should be in the IEP. When a person picks up the IEP, they should be able to know what the child's strengths and weaknesses are, and that should be located in the present levels of performance. You should know what the child's able to do and what the child's not able to do. There should be a baseline of where they are functioning, and then there should be, so that you know where they're functioning in order to measure where they're going to go within a year. The IEP must include an explanation of the extent to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the general education classroom, and any accommodations required in the classroom for standardized testing, and also what's going on in the classroom. Other important IEP components, transportation. It's important to know that with DC public schools or in DC schools, transportation isn't automatic just because you have an IEP. There's a worksheet that usually has to be examined before you determine whether the child actually gets transportation on their IEP or not, and then check on the IEP. Yes, you get transportation. No, you don't get transportation. Another IEP component is extended school year, which is essentially like summer school, but it's when a child receives special education services on their IEP during the summer, and it's typically a 4-week program in DC. The next component is a behavior intervention plan that usually accompanies an IEP if there are behavior needs of the child. And then a functional behavior assessment should be done in order to develop a behavior intervention plan. Just a little note about a functional behavior assessment. Functional behavior assessment is used to determine like what are the reasons for the behavior. The school should be able to figure out the triggers of the behavior in order to address them and to ensure that they don't recur. So you have a functional behavior assessment. For example, I'll give you a quick example is, let's say a kid is being suspended, they're having discipline problems in school, and if you have a meeting with the school and the school says they don't really know why the kid is acting out in school, that's a reason to trigger a functional behavior assessment to be done by the school. Typically, the social worker does it in order to determine what's causing the behavior, what's happening before the behavior happens, what happens after, what's the reason for it, in order to plan through a behavior intervention plan to address that behavior. Other IEP components, transition plan. This is required for children ages 16 and over. The transition plan is like transition into independent living is basically what the plan should be talking about. It should include training, education, employment, independent living skills if appropriate. A transition services plan is something that I will just say it usually falls at the end of an IEP meeting. It's something that's very important. So sometimes when you get caught up with the goals and the all the other components of the IEP, you might not have enough time to do the transition plan. If you have a child working on an IEP with a child that's 16 or older, you want to make sure that you allot time to go over the transition plan to make sure that transition plan is also appropriate. The transition plan, they usually do assessments to determine like what's the child going to do when they graduate. Are they gonna have a vocation? Are they going to go to college? What are they doing to prepare to get to that? That's what the goals should include in a transition plan. What are their appropriate goals? Are they learning how to fill out job applications? Are they taking tests for college admissions? Do they know how to fill out a college application? What do they like to do? What are their interests? Do they know how to, write a check, or do they know how to exchange money? Independent living skills. Where are they going to live? Are they going to live with their parents? Are they going to live somewhere else? What do they want to do? Those are the things that should be included in a transition plan. And it's very important that that transition plan is appropriate. And it doesn't just say, for example, we've seen transition plans that just say like this child likes sports and they want to be in the NFL. That's not necessarily an appropriate transition plan. You want to see what are they going to do, something that is appropriate and realistic. I've missed a slide here, but I guess I haven't. What factors should be considered when determining when to send their child? This has to do with placement. Just go forward here. Step 5. We'll go to step 5 and then we'll come back to that one. So step 5, after you have developed the IEP, you're going to want to talk about placement. So placement, the placement of the child. Placement includes the IEP, but it also includes the location. Typically when you talk about placement, you talk about it alongside in the same meeting as the IEP when you're talking about developing the goals, but it could also be separated and folded into another IEP meeting just to discuss placement. Placement is based on the individual needs of the child, and you must consider the IEP and the LRE requirements, as Cheryl talked about earlier, the LRE requirements. So we're going to go back to the group exercise. Let's think about what factors should be considered when determining what school to send their child to. The information a parent might want to consider, they might want to consider location. If it's, when it comes to DC schools, as we talked about, the child may not always get transportation. So if a child lives in Southeast DC, you have to consider, does it make sense? Does the child have transportation? Will they be able to get to a school if they want to go to a school in Northwest or Northeast? Is that something that should we take into consideration? That's one of the factors. If the child gets transportation, that may not be a factor. Parents might want to consider, how close am I to the child? A lot of times our parents want to be able to get to the school if they need to. What might be the top priorities in selecting school or classroom? The parent might want to know when thinking about placement, how many kids are in the classroom? How many teachers are in the classroom? They might look at test scores occasionally. What else they might want to consider? They might want to consider the program. What's the program? What does the program look like? What's a typical day for the student? What will the typical day for the student be in that classroom? What school would they go to after that school? These are all things they want to consider. How many teachers do they have? What kind of activities does the school have? These are all things that can be important when determining placement or thinking about placement. Above all, you want to make sure that the placement is a place that can serve the child. Is the classroom appropriate? What makes a classroom appropriate? If a child has needs that emotional needs, is it a therapeutic setting? Are there social workers on staff? Is there psychologists on staff every day? If the child has medical needs, is there a nurse in the school? All schools don't have nurses. Is that something that the school can get? Does a school, can a school get a nurse? How often do they need one? But also makes a classroom appropriate. The amount of students that are in the class, the amount of teachers that are in the class. Again, like I just talked about, if your child has needs that you need there to be 3 teachers to 3 students, that's a very small setting, a very restrictive setting. Or is it okay if the child is in a class with 20 students and 1 teacher? So there's a lot of factors you want to talk to with your client about what makes a classroom appropriate. Has to have what we call, IDA calls a continuum of placements. An LEA, your local education agency, your school district, such as DCPS, they have to be able to provide a continuum of placements, meaning some general ed class, instruction in general education classroom, instruction in special education classes. So instruction in general education classes includes inclusion, we call inclusion, which is getting services in the classroom with their general education peers, push-ins, they also call it push-in services. And then there's instruction in special education classes. That's the next level on the continuum. The continuum goes from least restrictive to the most restrictive. And so instruction in general education classes is the least restrictive. Instruction in special education classes, that's when you have what we call pull-out classes in academic subjects for related services. So a child may need 1 to 2 classes of their day pulled out, so that maybe they have a reading section, they're pulled out for reading, they're pulled out for math. And when they're pulled out, they're working with a special education teacher, either individually or in a group of like 2 to 3 students. And it can range from 1 to 2 classes to the bulk of the child's school day, which is the more restrictive, what we call a self-contained classroom, meaning everyone in the class is in special education and they're not with their general education peers. The next level on the continuum is a more restrictive setting, which is special schools. It's an educational placement where a child spends all for special education services. The next level, yes.
It's Jen. I think we just lost your audio just for the last maybe 10 seconds.
Okay.
But I hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So I'll just go back and say, talking about this special education schools, educational placement where a child spends all day in a special education setting with the special education peers, and in the special education school, there's no contact with general education peers during the day. It can be at a public school, which I just talked about, self-contained classroom, or a non-public school where the whole school is a special education school. The next level on the continuum is home instruction. Home instruction, again, when you're in special education, you have a right to get special education services regardless of whether you're in home and need it in home instruction or in a school building. So home instruction is the next level on the continuum. And then the most restrictive is instruction in hospitals and in institutions. So residential programs. Those are for children who are unable to function in the community, in addition to not being able to function in the school. Children with disabilities in residential programs must be able to access their special education, their specialized instruction, even if they're in a residential program. So going on to step 6, after you have your placement, the next step is IEP review. IEPs must be reviewed and revised as necessary, but at least once a year. A parent or a school can request an IEP meeting at any time if there's a concern about the provision of FAPE to the child. Here are some examples of when a parent can request. For example, if the child is regressing in academic or behavioral areas, if the child has begun to act out, or on the reverse of that, if a child has made excellent progress and the goals need to be adjusted. Regardless of this, a school can't say, "Oh, we reviewed the parent can't." If the parent says, "I have concerns, I want to review the IEP," it's not appropriate for the school to say, "Oh, we already reviewed it. You have to wait till next year." A parent can request a meeting at any time. So we're going to look at practice reading an IEP, and so we're going to look at the IEP. We're just going to look at it right here at the screen I'm sharing. This is an example of what a DC Public Schools IEP. As you can see at the top, it says Individualized Education Program. So looking at this IEP, what is the eligibility classification and where is that found? You can find the eligibility classification. This is in the information that I think you guys have, but this is the eligibility information. This is where it's found on the IEP. This is the front page of an IEP. You can see the eligibility classification right here is emotional disturbance. And then the next question, what type of IEP meeting is this? You can find that here where it says IEP meeting details, type of meeting. This is an annual review. So this is the IEP's been 1 year and they're here to review it again. And what's the date of the meeting? The date of the meeting is found here, meeting date.
Shani, we lost your audio again. There you are.
Oh, okay. Did you stop hearing me for a second?
Just after you noticed where the meeting date was, but
Okay.
you can start on this page. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So type of the meeting. So what services does this student receive? That's found on the almost close to the last page of the IEP, and it's here. This is a snapshot of it. Special education and related services at the top. This tells you the services that the child has. So you can see specialized instruction. The setting is out of general education setting, which means they're all in a special education school. The time, 25 hours per week. And then you can see the related services here. Occupational therapy, speech language, behavior support services. They're receiving those all outside of the general education services. So there is no inclusion or pull out. They are completely in a special education school. Another way you can tell they're in a special education school is you can look at this as a DCPS IEP, but the school site says High Road Upper School of Prince George's County in Beltsville, Maryland. So that is another indication that you're in a special education school. Step 7, reevaluation. A child who receives special education services must be reevaluated in all areas of suspected disability every 3 years, unless all members of the team agree that it's not necessary. All members of the team include the parent, so the school may not unilaterally make a decision to not evaluate. A team's decision not to evaluate should be documented, and a child can be reevaluated more frequently at the request of the parent or the teacher. I think there's a slide about this. If something else happens, they can be reevaluated. If there's a change, for example, I had a child who had alcohol poisoning and then had a traumatic brain, and because of that had a traumatic brain injury. We requested another evaluation before the 3 years was up because there had been a change and the school had noticed a difference in her cognitive level. This is kind of just what we're talking about. Schools must also reevaluate child as conditions warrant. Sudden change in school performance, significant event in child's life impacting school performance. Just going to briefly talk about IEP versus 504 plans. If you get a case, it's unlikely you're going to get a case that involves a 504 plan, unless the 504 plan is something that typically our cases that our mentees get are cases where there's IEPs. But this is just a chart here so you can see the difference between IEPs and 504 plans. One of the main differences is the legal protections. The legal protections under IEPs are stronger under IDEA. Under 504 plans, if things don't go right with the 504 plan, you don't really have the teeth to really have a due process hearing. What you would do is you would file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. And it's just you're not really involved in it once it gets to OCR. So a lot of our cases, most of our clients, we are leaning towards having an IEP. Unfortunately, in DC public schools, in DC, that 504 plan, not to say that they can't work, they can be strong, but a lot of times they're used to get out of having an IEP. So that's one of the things we want to be mindful of. I'm going to just briefly talk about discipline. There's a new discipline law, Student Fair Access to School Amendment Act. That is a pretty new discipline law that has caused a lot of changes because it's a uniform school discipline reform that applies to DCPS and public charter schools. It sets limits on schools' use of suspensions, expulsions, and involuntary transfers. The main things you want to know about this new discipline law is out-of-school suspensions cannot exceed 5 consecutive school days for grades K through 5. Out-of-school suspensions cannot exceed 10 consecutive days for grades 6 through 12. And a student cannot be suspended from school for more than 20 cumulative school days in a school year unless the head of the LEA provides written justification for the emergency suspension. This is, for obvious reasons, kids are not in school, so obviously there's no out-of-school suspensions, and so issues of discipline have come to a complete halt. But even before we got to that, once this law was passed, we saw a substantial drop in cases that dealt with disciplinary actions by the school. So there's something to be aware of, assuming that kids go back to the brick and mortar school building, but just know that that is a new law. So if a school were to try to suspend a kid for 90 days, they would be in.
Janine, we lost you just at when you were talking about if a school were to try to suspend a child for 90 days. That was just the last thing I heard. I'm still not hearing you, but we'll let you know when I do.
Eligible for special education. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why the audio keeps going in and out. I'm sorry, everyone. But if the school system knew or should have known that the child is a child with a disability, then they're still covered under the IDEA protections for discipline laws. And I'm just going to skip through this slide. There are a little bit. I'm just going to kind of breeze through it. There are extra protections for students with disabilities. schools must convene a manifestation determination review to determine whether a child's behavior is a manifestation of a disability. If you have an MDR, which you are not probably going to have one anytime soon with the case, reach out to your mentor to talk through it and talk more about it. Manifestation determination review, it has to be conducted within 10 days. You have to ask the questions: is the conduct in question caused by or had a direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability? If the conduct in question, you have to also ask if the conduct in question was a direct result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP.
We lost you again, Janine. I'll let you know when I hear you.
And then the results.
We just heard you as you transitioned to this page, Janine. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry. So there's a lot of information that you're going to consider when looking at a manifestation determination review. But that I'm just going to breeze through that and then just talk about if the team answers yes to questions about that we just talked about, the behavior is deemed to be a manifestation of the child's disability, and the disciplinary action must be rescinded. So if it turns out that the behavior is a manifestation of the disability, the child should be returning to school. There's an exception for incidents where the child had dangerous weapon, drugs, or caused by serious bodily injury. If it is a manifestation of a child's disability, the school should be, the IEP team should be conducting a functional behavior assessment and create a behavior intervention plan, or review a behavior intervention plan that already exists and modified as necessary. And like we talked about before, permit the child to return to school. If the parent disagrees, there's always the option of an expedited due process hearing is always available. And if that comes up, again, we're in this COVID time, so it's probably not going to come up, but that's something you should talk to your mentor about. Okay, so school discipline hypothetical, I'm just going to read through it. Devontae is a 6th grader with an IEP that provides specialized instruction and counseling services. His disability classification is other health impairment. So let's just say he has ADHD. And
Janine, we lost you, but I'm sure folks are able to read the rest of the hypo on the slide. I'll let you know again when we hear back your audio.
Other information you might want.
There you go.
Other information you might want, there's a manifestation determination. You might want to ask for the records for the child. Are they getting their counseling services? Are they, have they been in FAPE before? Are there any disciplinary records that the school has? Some arguments you would raise at a manifestation determination review would be, you'd want to ask about the counselor. Why is does he have a counselor? Who is his counselor? Has he been receiving counseling services? The arguments the school might raise, they might raise arguments that one of the other arguments you might want to raise is a time they're referring for a 30-day suspension. That would be inappropriate now with the new law. And then the things that the school might argue, they might say he knew what he was doing, which is inappropriate to say. The standard is not whether they knew what they were doing. The standard is for, is it a manifestation of their disability? I think you could argue that it could be, but the school might say it's not. The school might say he doesn't need counseling right now. So those are just different types of things that might come up in a school discipline manifestation determination review meeting. So what's next? Special education training part 2. And I guess Jen's going to talk about that and handling a special education case. And I'm just going to turn it back over to her. Sorry for the audio issues. And hope to see you on Wednesday.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janine. We are navigating the waters here of doing things remotely, and there's something new every day. But thanks, everybody, for hanging with us. Janine, thank you for just going right with it, rolling with the punches, as you always do training. So for part 2, that's right. That's what's coming up. We've got 2 more parts. Part 2 is going to focus on handling a special education case. What do we mean by that? We're really going to talk about working with our clients. We're going to talk about you all working with mentors at CLC, and then some tips. What are these meetings that we're having with schools? What are some maybe do's and don'ts in terms of our best practices? Part 3, we're going to talk about cases when they litigate, or just thinking about that possibility. Most of our cases are not litigating, but we're always thinking about how we build a case from the beginning regardless. The due process hearing is the focus of part 3, and that's the litigation in these types of cases. We're also in that part 3 training going to talk about some COVID-19 considerations for practice. So be sure to check that out. If you have questions, we will end this recording for those watching on demand in just a moment. For those of you joining us live, you can feel free to engage with us after the recording ends. But I just want to thank everybody again for joining in part 1. These cases come to us in many ways. Our clients and their children are facing a variety of issues. And so ultimately the key in figuring out a case for you and how you navigate that particular case is talking with me in the front end and then working with a mentor through the specifics of the family that you're serving. So thank you so much again. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here. Thanks for joining us for part 1, and hope that you'll join us for part 2 and part 3.